I'm Dr. Tommy Smith. I'm the Provost, Chief Academic Officer here at Johnson University, but for many years was a history professor here and have been involved in the capstone course since its inception. And so I am very interested in what you all are doing as students in this course, and very interested in and thankful that I can participate in this process with you. I want to talk today about a historical perspective on ethics. I want to ask the question, what can the discipline of history bring to our understanding of ethics? For that, really two main reasons, two things that you want to make sure that you get out of this presentation. The first is you want to ask the question, what is the discipline of history? What do we mean by a historical perspective? What unique dimension does the study of history bring to our study of the ethical decision-making process? And then a more practical question that we want to think about is, how can this help you in your own research as you take your case study, as you work through it with your group? How can this perspective help you in that process? So both the theoretical question, what is the perspective, what is the line of inquiry that history brings to our ethical decision-making process, and then the more practical question of how this can help me. Make sure that in your notes that you address those two issues. Many people, when you approach the discipline of history, think, oh no, I hate history. Many have had difficulty with history courses in the past. And many times that's because for them history became a sort of endless list of people and places and dates. You know, we all remember memorizing all the names of the capitals of the states in order, and we thought, you know, what is the relevancy of this? How does history relate to me? And many students have difficulty with history, and it's mainly because they think of history only in terms of content. Well, when you look at the discipline of history, you have to say, first of all, yes, history does contribute to our knowledge base. History does have content. There must be facts about various subjects that we have to deal with. So history can't do without facts, but certainly history is more than facts. In fact, the key to understanding the individual content is to be able to put those facts in a larger context. And so context becomes very, very important for historical study, because that's what gives meaning to the names and the places and the dates and the events. And without an overall scheme of that, it's very difficult to understand. So in our discussion of a historical perspective, we certainly do not want to ignore how history informs our content about various subjects. But that's really not what I want to talk about in this presentation. I want to look at how history also provides a technique for us to conduct our intellectual inquiry. History not only offers content, but it also offers a method. It gives us the ability to examine those subjects. And so we use the phrase, a line of inquiry, to say that here's how you can come at this particular topic from this historical perspective. And so we'll talk some about content, because you want to be able to have good facts. You want to be able to verify those facts. Your argument is going to be based on solid evidence. But how we collect that evidence, how we interpret that evidence, how we place that evidence, those facts, into a larger context, that has to do more with the methodology that we want to develop. So let's talk first of all a little bit about a definition of history, and as we look at how we define history, then we can talk about one of the key elements of that, and that is causation. And look at that dimension of history with the intent of trying to understand historical study as a methodology that can help us in our ethical decision-making process. One definition of history is that it is an orderly and systematic study of the available records of the human past. Now, if you unpack that backwards, we recognize that we're talking about the past. History cannot predict the future. History is not a predictive science. It deals with what happened in the past. And just as a scientist who cannot get outside of his or her scope of study, the historian has to be very careful that they stay within their scope of study as well. And of course, we're dealing with the human past. There are other dimensions of historical study: archaeology, geology, anthropology, and so forth, that help us in understanding the past, that may deal with other dimensions, other aspects of the past, but history deals with the human past. And it deals with available records. Sometimes you'll hear someone say, well, the history is everything that happened in the past. Well, it can't be that, because we do not have records of everything that happened in the past. We are dealing with the evidence that we have from the past. We make our judgments based on those available records. Knowing that, by the way, can help you as you think about your case study project. You as a group will be making choices and decisions and coming to a position and developing a thesis and an argument, but you're going to base that on the information that you have available. You're not going to have every piece of evidence on the particular topic that you're studying, so you make the best judgment that you can according to the available record or the available evidence that you have. And then we look at the available records of the human past in an orderly and systematic way. And here's methodology. The methodology asks, how do we do this in an orderly way, in a systematic way? How do we assemble the evidence? How do we examine, interpret that evidence? How do we analyze and then synthesize that? And then how do we translate that into some kind of an argument with good, sound evidence? So in one sense, history is certainly a science in that it operates in an orderly and systematic way. In some ways, history is an art, because anytime you're dealing with the human past, with human beings, you're making judgment calls, you're making interpretations based on the best evidence that you have. Another definition of history is that it is an inquiry into the record of human actions which reaches conclusions based on the sound interpretation of evidence and leads to human self-knowledge. Now, this definition includes more of a methodological approach. It begins with asking the right questions. History is an inquiry. Now, we learn basic facts. We learn new facts as more evidence becomes available. But most of the time, what we take to our historical study are new questions. Every context, every cultural context, every situation asks different questions of the past. And so one of the key dimensions of historical study is learning how to ask the right questions and to frame your inquiry by the questions. Again, in your case study approach, you're going to be framing a research question. And how you frame that question is going to be very important in the kind of inquiry that you conduct. Secondly, this definition says we have to examine the right facts. What are the pertinent facts? What is the evidence? And we have to consider that from a holistic point of view. We don't just choose the facts that seem to support our particular view. And so we not only ask the right questions, but then we want to gather our evidence so that we've got the right kind of information that will help us make the kinds of choices that we're called to choose. And then in that, we want to make sure we use good historical judgment. And that means bringing our experiences in examining and interpreting and constructing to in a certain way our understanding of the past. And we do that for a good purpose. And the why question is very, very important. Why are we conducting this inquiry? Why are we looking at these particular facts? Why is it important that we do that? Using good, sound rules of evidence and interpretation. It's because we want understanding that would lead to a good purpose. In your case, you're looking at the good purpose related to ethics. And I know that you've studied in other areas the connection with ethics to what is the good. So as a historian, I want to look at first what happened. Without the good factual evidence, it's very, very difficult. In fact, it's impossible to conduct sound interpretation. That means that the sources that I choose are very important. I want to make sure that I understand the difference between primary and secondary sources. That primary sources are, in essence, sources in their own words, sources that are directly related to whatever the event or the person might be. And of course, those are the better sources. The secondary sources are those sources that talk about those people or that event or that particular circumstance. It's later understanding and interpretation of those events. Those are very helpful, but you want to make sure that there's a good connection between the primary and secondary sources. Now, in your case study, you'll be dealing with some primary sources, and I would encourage you that when you can, make sure you do use the primary sources, but you're mostly going to be using articles and books and so forth that are secondary sources. This is also why it's very important to verify and cite your sources. You want to make sure that these are good sources, that the evidence that you use is based on all of the appropriate rules of evidence. So you want to make sure when you use a fact that you verify that to the best of your understanding and knowledge that that is true. That is a valid fact. And then certainly within your presentation, if you have key pieces of evidence, you want to make sure that you cite those sources so that your audience can have confidence in you, that you have used those sources appropriately and that these are the facts in the case that you're dealing with. But history, of course, as we have already said, is more than just facts. It's more than just what happened. And to me, the most interesting part of history is the interpretive dimension of history, why it happened. And so in trying to determine why it happened, you have to look at the cultural context. You have to look at the worldview level. And think about those sort of deep level assumptions that are there. So if these folks acted in this way, what was it about their fundamental assumptions about the nature of the universe or the nature of God or the nature of human beings or the nature of life itself? How do those fundamental assumptions play out in the words and the actions and the deeds of people? Interpretation always has to get at those deeper levels of the human experience. And then in the interpretive question, the interpretation question, there's always the issue of causation. When we ask why, we are in essence saying, what caused this? Now, causation is a very complicated issue, particularly related to historical studies, and we want to talk more about that in just a few minutes. But it becomes a sort of central question to the methodology because you're asking why something happened. And we assume that the better we understand why something happened, then the better we can contribute to our understanding of what we do with that information and how that affects our choices and decisions and the way we think now. So historical research as a methodology is both a process of discovery. We're trying to understand what happened, but it's also a process of construction of knowledge. We're trying to interpret and understand why something happened. And I believe that as we engage in that study, it provides a very important window through which we can gain understanding. Now let's come back to this idea of historical causation. The causation question essentially can be stated, what changes over time and why does it change? Or you might phrase it, what doesn't change over time and why didn't it change? It asks the question, what drives or what moves history? Is history moved mainly by great people with great ideas? Is history moved primarily by geopolitical factors? Marx, for example, argued in his Principle of Economic Determinism that history is moved by money. It's moved by these long-term economic factors. Those are all important questions to ask in whatever circumstance we're examining. What is the moving force here? What is the driving force? We're looking for a dynamic of history. We're looking for a mechanism that drives history. And as we try to understand a person or an event or a situation or an idea, causation becomes very important in the ability to understand that. Now, the philosopher who helps us the best with causation was Aristotle. Aristotle sort of defined the categories, to use an Aristotelian term. Aristotle really is the person in the West who set this conversation of causation. And we really haven't changed much in our thinking about causation since Aristotle. Aristotle has whole treatises on causation. You could summarize Aristotle's view toward causation in his 4 causes: material causes, efficient causes, final causes, and formal causes. And we won't go into all the distinctions there. You can get a good philosophy textbook or a good introduction to Aristotle and get that. But a historical view toward causation, I think, can benefit from this Aristotelian model. Because in essence, and I'm combining the final and formal causes into a single category, in looking at history, you essentially have 3 sets of causes. You have what I'm calling sources, and these are the sort of long-term, big picture, meta-narrative kinds of causes that if something happened, it happened because of some long-term, maybe even centuries long-term factors that then finally culminated in that. Secondly, influences. And those are things within the circumstance surrounding the person or event or idea and so forth that may not have directly influenced that, but certainly the event would not have happened in the way that it happened without those influences. So you've got sort of big picture sources, more direct but still more general influences, and then you have direct causes, those things that are directly related to the person or the event or the idea. Let me give you an example of that. King James Version of the Bible, published in 1611. What led to the publication of the King James Version of the Bible? Well, from a source point of view, from the big picture, we would want to look at the whole emphasis in the latter Middle Ages of the emergence of a more literate middle class who could read and wanted reading material. We could look at the religious dimension of an increasing emphasis on the authority of Scripture rather than the authority of church tradition that emphasize reading the Scriptures in one's own language. We might look at the technological influences of something like the Gutenberg movable type and the printing press. Those would be sources. They're not directly related to the King James Version of the Bible, but without those sources, you would not have had a King James Version of the Bible. In terms of influence, we could look more at the reformers of the 16th century. You could look at Luther's Bible, Wycliffe's Bible. You could look at the whole tradition of English Bible translation. Again, you could look at education and the emergence of a more literate middle class. You could look at the economic and social factors related to literacy and Bible translation. You could look at some of the early Bible translators in the 16th and 17th century. Those would be the influences. And then once we get to the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, we could look at King James. We could look at the Puritan context of that. We could look at the direct influence of something like Wycliffe's Bible on that. So you move in a way where you go from the broadest sources to the influences to the more direct causes. And so again, that provides us what a historical perspective might look like. And you can start at either end of that. So you get your case study for this particular course. You may want to work backwards. In trying to understand the facts of this case, which you want to be able to do, and to be able then to interpret those facts into a meaningful conclusion. What are the fine brush events, people, ideas? What are the things that you need to know in order to address that particular case study? And then as you look at those direct causes of what you need to know, what helps us understand those? What are those influences that we connect with those direct causes? And then the sources cause us to look at even the bigger issues. And in fact, to me, going through this method of historical interpretation can help you in framing your research question, in defining the angle that you're going to take on this case study. It provides a good methodology, a good starting methodology to conduct your particular inquiry. You may do it backwards. You may take your case study and say, okay, what are the big issues here? What are the sources of this? What do we need to understand from the broadest brush background, concepts, movements, ideas, and so forth, and then move to more specific. You can do it either way. But again, my point here is that history provides us a good methodology to be able to conduct meaningful inquiry. And so for that reason, a historical perspective on ethics can be very valuable in this process for us. Thank you, and I wish you the best as you continue this course of study.